Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, I'm Nolan. I'm going to be talking about simple provenance in scientific databases. So, in particular, I'm going to focus on the provenance situation for SDSS, which is a database system. I'll be talking about how we implemented provenance for it and what we learned from it. So, I was going to start with why lots of science data is going into databases, but I think we've heard enough of that. So, with scientific data, it's not enough to just return the data sometimes. When you're providing such data, it's also important that people can get that data later through the same process, and that they can, they're assured that they can get the data at a later date. Right. So the data itself is not enough. We need to ensure that it can still be retrieved, even if some of the sources have changed. We need to provide provenance for results. So in this talk, first I'm going to describe our database environment and some of the properties in this environment that make the provenance problem interesting. The next part is how we implemented provenance for this environment. And the last part's about what we learned from it. So our database environment hosts mostly data from a project called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, or SDSS. And it's an astronomy survey that intends to map over a quarter of the sky in great detail. So far we have about 40 terabytes of database data. As far as provenance goes, it's not so much the type of data that SDSS provides, but it's instead the way the data is released. So SDSS releases data really infrequently, about once a year. When it does release data, it doesn't change any existing data sets. It releases the new data as a brand new set of data that contains all the old data and the new data too. This means that SDSS databases are reliably read-only. Catalog contents never change. Instead, you just get new catalogs. So, in a read-only database, provenance is usually pretty easy. Since the contents of the catalog never change, if you want to recreate a data set you got, all you have to do is rerun the original query. In our environment, though, we have a few extra factors that make this problem more interesting. One of these is cache jobs, which is the interface that we provide web access through. So there are some features in cache jobs that are useful, but the one that's important to provenance is MyDB, which is server-side storage for users. This means that every user gets their own database on the server, and they can fill this with whatever they want. This could be the results from queries on the read-only database, or it could be their own data that they uploaded directly to us. So this means that objects in MyDB can be the results of one or many queries, and it could be dependent on lots of different objects. So the provenance problem is determining which objects those are. Next. So that's the kind of problem our provenance system is trying to solve. So this system is a really lightweight provenance system. It only depends on queries and the time they were submitted and the user that submitted them, basic query log stuff. It progresses in 3 stages. The first stage is to take all the queries and pre-process them. The second is to generate object dependency graphs, and the third is to generate the result. Right, so skipping to the end, the result of this process is the simplest part of the whole process. So in a database, if you exclude things that aren't logged, like bulk uploads and that kind of stuff, then every object that's in the database was created through one or more SQL queries. So the goal of this provenance system is just to return the sequence of queries that recreates an object. Wait. Okay. So the pre-processing step of this process is to first process all the queries and distill them down to just the data we're going to need for provenance. So SQL is fairly complex with a bunch of different constructs and all that kind of stuff, but for the purpose of provenance, we don't really care about most of them. All we're looking for in this thing is to find unique objects in a query, and we need to find their usage. So 3 object types are tables, functions, and stored procedures. Each of these 3 types have 4 different usage cases. So they might be created in a query, they could be changed in the query through like an update or an insert, or they could be destroyed in the query. If an object's in the query but it doesn't fall into any of those cases, then you can consider it a dependency because the query doesn't actually change the object, but the query can't be run without it. So the first step in the pre-processing process is to take every query and convert it into a set of tuples, where each tuple represents the information we're looking for. The tuple is just the name of the object and some tag that encompasses the type of the object it is and how it was used. So as an example, in this query, we can see it's selecting into a table called myTable, so it creates this table. So it gets a tag called ctab that's appropriate. You can't run this query without photo primary or neighbors, so these tables need to be tagged too, and they get a different tag, indicating the dependency. And as far as tagging goes, this is it. This is all we need to know about this query to generate, or to relate this query to a provenance later. As far as building a provenance goes, once we've tagged every query, we don't need the query anymore. We just look at the tags. We only need the query at the last step when we actually want to recreate an object we have a provenance for. So most of the query is ignored. Things like joins and columns and conditions. These are important to the query, but not to determine whether the query is related to the provenance of an object. The idea is once we build the sequence of queries that we're after and actually run them, if we get all the queries in the right order, these kind of details should resolve themselves on their own. So that was one query. We need to do this for a whole bunch of queries. And once we have all the queries tagged, we can take those tags and store them in a database, in a table actually, and then index the table. So with this index table, we can figure out, or we can determine the answer to any question we might need to ask during provenance construction. So what those questions are is the next part. So the second stage of this provenance is dependency graph generation. So to determine the provenance of a given object, the first step we take is we find the most recent query that altered that object. So in this slide is showing the first step for myTable. We search the tag database and see that the most recent query that changed this table is called query 1. Once we find the query, we look up all the other dependencies in that query. In this case, there's my other table and photo primary. And then we do the same thing for those objects. So for those objects, we look up the queries that most recently changed those, and then we follow the dependency of those. So we can keep doing this until we don't find any more queries. Once we do this, all of the queries run in dependency order should be the provenance of the object. Did I forget anything? Right. So the primary output of this process is a list of queries, but we also provide a kind of graphical representation of the provenance. That's what's shown. It's more or less the same as the Paint Pro slides from the previous ones, but It's a little bit different, and it's optimized for showing larger provenances. For instance, they take out the queries. The queries are moved. So in this arrangement, you have queries and you have objects. And objects is just some object with the same name. It's not necessarily the same data. Objects are on the left. Queries are on the top. Every cell represents a unique version of an object. So it could mean that the data is changed in the object. And the lines just indicate dependencies. When in this kind of rendering, this is showing the provenance for the object myTable1. So the highlighted column is just the most recent query that created that object. One of the dependencies of that query was PRU1, and that query is shown here, and you can follow this all the way back to the unknown stuff. So not all objects have full SQL logs, which is okay in our particular environment. So the kind of objects that don't have a logs are usually objects that were like bulk uploaded or just unlogged, but we have pretty good logs. So if we don't have queries for this object, but we know that they haven't changed, then they don't pose a problem for recreating a provenance. All we have to do is ensure that those objects are still there, and things should run okay. It can be a little problematic with user-uploaded tables. So if a user had uploaded a table into MyDB and dropped it later, then he wouldn't be able to generate a provenance for that object, for any objects dependent on that object in the future. But this is a problem in this plan because this plan was generated retroactively. But in the future, you could do checks on queries. And if a user tried to drop something that would break any other future provenances, you could at least warn them. Right, so that was a really simple plan. This is a really big one. There are hundreds of thousands of queries. Hopefully in this bigger plan you can see why the weird rendering makes sense. It's easier to track objects in this. You can just look at, say, a row, and you can see all the versions of the objects, and you can see all of the objects in a query. It's still really hard to read, but it's a little clearer. So when you get a plan of this size, you might ask a question or two. Some of the questions we asked are, how many objects do we have with this kind of complicated provenance behind them? How many users are doing this kind of thing? Is this a normal thing or a more anomalous thing? If you're trying to answer these questions with just a query log, this is kind of a hard question to answer. But we have a nice tag database and the provenance for every object. So using those, we can try to answer that kind of question. One thing to look at is just the tag distribution for all of the query set that we covered. I didn't even talk about the query set. So we ran this on all of the queries and cast jobs, which is since 2003, I think. And I think it's about 500,000 queries. It's a lot of queries, and at the time, I think it was from 2,000 registered users. These are all of the tags for all of those queries. The tags are named at the bottom. They're usually tab is table, SP is stored procedure, and anyway. The most common tag, it's also a logarithmic scale, so small differences are really big. The most common one is the tab dependency. Oh, and light columns are objects that aren't in MyDB, and dark columns are columns that are, or objects that are. The most common tag is tab dependency for tables that aren't in MyDB, which makes sense given that people are coming to this site to query our data. Other things you can see is that tables are dropped almost as frequently as they're created. It's hard to tell exactly what that means. It could mean that users are really tidy. They're always cleaning up tables they create. But it seems a good guess that their MyDB size is too small. So they have a finite size of data to work with, and this indicates that they're continuing to have to free up space, maybe. You can also see errors in this distribution. So technically, since we host mostly read-only catalogs plus MyDB, People shouldn't be able to create objects in MyDB. But you can see from the tags that there have been quite a few cases where people have. Given that the tags are only based on queries that succeeded, we don't tag failed queries, and it's a bad sign. Initially, I thought this was a parsing error, but apparently it's not. Apparently, at some point, SDSS had a configuration error on the server, and people could write to non-MyDB contexts, and you can see that on the chart. So the rest of this is focusing on MyDB. Providing users with server-side storage is kind of a gamble. You don't know if they're really going to use it. You don't know how well they're going to use it. It could help them in their work, or it could just get in their way. So since we have provenance for every object, we can kind of exploit that and try and figure out if they're actually using it well. And so the next few slides we'll be trying to profile users. We'll be trying to see how many users actually use MyDB in the way that we intended, which was as a workbench, and how many are just kind of, it's getting in the way for them. Right, so we originally intended MyDB to be a workbench. This means that it's not just a place to dump your results and get them later. It should be a place where you're continually re-referencing objects that you've created before. Right. That's a little bit tough to measure, so we have a couple of metrics for it. The first one is the maximum object versions. One way that would tell you with pretty good confidence that the user is using MyDB in a workbench fashion is if they have an object in their MyDB, or they used to have an object in their MyDB that has more than one version. This means that they've updated an object in their MyDB at least once. So this chart is classifying users by their one object with the most versions. So unfortunately, this doesn't look very good. 20% of users only 20% of users have revised data in a MyDB table more than once. Given that the first version, the create, counts as a version, that's bad. 6% of users have never even used MyDB at all. That indicates that users don't really use object versions that often, but that doesn't necessarily indicate that they're not using MyDB as a workbench. For example, in SQL, it's syntactically a lot easier to use objects as dependencies in new objects rather than updating old objects. So this metric is designed to look for that. What else is it? Right, so instead of looking for object versions in this one, we're looking for the number of other dependencies on other objects that they've created within the same query. And we classify each user by the object they have with the most complex provenance, counting those objects. Does that make any sense? Okay. Right. So the idea is if the users used MyDB as a workbench at some point, they should have at least one object in their history that's dependent on another object in MyDB. That would indicate that they've at least taken a two-step process to the thing. So using this metric, the results are a little bit better. 38% have used a MyDB object twice. Or no, is it once? Anyway. But it's still not very good. That's still less than half the users. It would be nice if both of these metrics were talking about different sets of users, but unfortunately they're not. So every user that's ever created an object version in this data set has also created a maximum or a dependency query. So 30% is the top, or 38%. So it would seem that only 38% of our users are using MyDB in the fashion that we intended them to be using it, according to this metric. But user counts are in everything. So the next thing, and the last thing that we're looking at here is query contribution. Since every user that passed version was also in dep, we can ignore dep. So we're just going to look at, we can ignore version. So we're just looking at user dependencies here. This time, instead of counting the users, we're also correlating them with the number of queries that have come from those users in a given category. So the chart on the left is the same one from here. That's classifying users. The chart on the right is color coordinated to be the same sets of users, but this time it's looking at how many queries they've run. So when you look at it this way, it looks pretty good. So as far as users that have passed the test, that have used MyDB in an approved fashion, it's almost 77% of the queries have come from those users. This doesn't mean that everyone's using MyDB. Great. This is also not the most definitive metric, because in order to make a multi-step object, it just requires more queries. But it seems like a good sign. It seems like a pretty safe indication that at least a healthy portion of users have adopted the workbench pattern. So this is our lightweight provenance implementation. It's not the most robust implementation in the world, but the positives are it requires next to no storage overhead. All you need is a tag database, and the tags take up less room than the query logs. Everything it needs is in the query logs, so you don't need to have an active database to run this. You can generate provenance for objects that don't exist anymore, or you can generate the list of queries for even when you don't have the database. You can't recreate them, but at least you can still see your work. It's pretty simple to implement. All the downsides tend to revolve around it actually having to rerun all of the work. It doesn't cache anything. So in order to recreate an object, you have to do all of the work that you did again. And it can be slow to recreate objects. But for a certain type of data environment that's mostly, that hosts primarily non-volatile data and has extensive query logs, then this seems, at least for us, like a pretty good way to do provenance. All done.